Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto went through puberty again. Our heroes did not come from a future where everything has gone horribly wrong. They did not travel back in time to save the world from a bleak or miserable fate. As a matter of fact, all they want to do is find a way back home as soon as possible. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 1, Time Travel is a Terrible Idea. I am not going through puberty again. Naruto Uzumaki, Lord 7th Hokage, had absolutely no reason to travel back in time. When he was younger and more naive, he may have desired to undo some of the tragic losses in his life, but the man he was now knew that such things were an inevitable, even necessary part of his life. He was much older and wiser than he had been during the Fourth Shinobi War. He knew better than to go fooling around with the laws of nature. Theoretically, time travel was possible. Nothing in what Shinobi knew of physics and the laws of causality directly contradicted this. There were even some who claimed it had been done before, who claimed to know of people who knew of scrolls which held such powerful and forbidden techniques, and while there was no definitive proof that any of these alleged time travel jutsu were authentic, scholars on such matters generally agreed that there was always a chance. Which was why the Lord 7th Hokage went to such lengths to seal away any and all such jutsu scrolls he came across. Whether they worked or not, it was Naruto's opinion that time travel was something far too dangerous to be risked. He had no desire to find out if any of those so-called time travel jutsu actually worked. As far as he was concerned, the risks far outweighed any of the meager potential benefits. The world was at peace. It wasn't a perfect utopia by any means, and there were still occasional, limited conflicts, but compared to the uneasy, watchful peace of his youth, and the all-out chaos of his teenage years, what the hidden villages had now was like a dream. So much effort had been put into forging and upholding these truces, these goodwill pacts of limited mutual disarmament and demilitarization, that Konoha's Honorable Nanadime saw the possibility of time travel as nothing but a headache just waiting to happen. The alliances, the promises, the slowly and painstakingly established friendships which had enabled all of this to be achieved were all just too valuable to be thrown away in a fit of pique. He was not about to let anyone stupidly undo all of the work he and the other Kage had done, especially not anyone so full of themselves as to honestly think that they could do better. Nothing was perfect. What they had now was as close as Naruto believed they would ever achieve within his lifetime. So he wasn't about to let anyone go and start fucking up everything he and his comrades had sacrificed so much to accomplish. Naruto Uzumaki had no reason to go back in time. Some things may not have turned out how he would have wanted, but the risk of undoing all of the good was just too high, too appalling, to even consider. Unfortunately for the Lord 7th Hokage, however, the powers that be would apparently beg to differ. When the 35-year-old Naruto woke up in a filthy, dank apartment, his first instinct was to wonder if Kiba had dragged him off to some dump on a bender. His second instinct, upon getting out of bed only to stumble over his own feet and land flat on his face, was to wonder what the hell his drinks had been spiked with. It wasn't until he stood and shook his head, looking around and narrowing his eyes, that he realized something was very amiss. The scale of this room was all off. It was far too big for an ordinary person. He wasn't exactly the tallest guy around, but he wasn't a shrimp either. And Naruto hadn't been this close to being at eye level with a doorknob while standing straight up since he was just a kid. I swear, if this is Yamato's idea of a prank. The Lord 7th muttered, scowling and grumbling about wood-style users with terrible senses of humor. Standing back up, Naruto extended his chakra senses, expecting to find a telltale trace of the Umbu captain's pine-scented essence. What he found instead left him extremely bemused. He was surrounded by unfamiliar chakra signatures. And while maybe only one or two of those signatures were actually within a dozen meters of him, it was still suspicious enough to make him frown. Naruto crossed his arms, wondering absently why they felt scrawnier than he remembered. He was very proud of his sensory ninjutsu. Years of refining his technique with help from Karen Neshin had enabled him to wield considerable empathic powers even without tapping into Kurama's chakra. Even half asleep and possibly hungover, Naruto had a rough maximum sensory range of 100 kilometers. If he dipped into Kurama's chakra, his area of perception would easily encompass almost the entirety of the elemental nations. And while Naruto wasn't anywhere near obsessive enough to try and commit every one of those innumerable chakra signatures to memory, particularly since his ability to detect life was acute enough to even pick out individual microscopic organisms, if he focused, to feel only 2 or 3 immediately familiar auras within his entire base range of perception was distinctly worrying. The signatures he did recognize, however, were sufficiently reassuring to head off any hints of tension that might have otherwise begun to surface. When Sasuke Uchiha woke up that morning, the first thing he noticed was that he had 2 arms. For most people, this would have been entirely reasonable, even expected. But Sasuke had not had a full left arm since his teenage years, when the limb had been blown off in a clash of obscenely high-powered jutsu between him and his closest friend/fiercest rival. So to wake up with one was disconcerting and vaguely annoying, to say the least. After the end of the Fourth Secret War, Naruto and most of those closest to Sasuke had almost immediately forgiven and forgotten all of his many transgressions between the ages of 13 and 17, ranging from defection, attempted murder, high treason, assassinating the acting Hokage, several more counts of attempted murder, and trying to spark a continent-wide revolution. They were happy to have him back, and liked to pretend that none of that stuff had ever really happened. Tsunade and Sakura had even tried to hook him up with a Shode putty prosthetic shortly after the war. But Sasuke had refused this offer vehemently. Partly, his reasoning had to do with the fact that the idea of replacing his missing arm with a bunch of mutant adult stem cells from a man who had died around half a century ago was just gross. He couldn't even stand drinking from another person's canteen, and they expected him to be fine and dandy with gluing some sort of tree man corpse tumor onto the stump of his elbow? Yeah, no. His fight with Kabuto had left Sasuke borderline paranoid about body modification. That naked chick crawling out of the man's chest and flashing him with her lifeless clone tits had been traumatizing enough. He didn't want to have the stem cells of some long-dead Senju fused to his shoulder. That would be just a little too Madara for his tastes. Of course, aside from the Uchiha's squeamishness, there was also the underlying motivation of atonement. He may have been forgiven for most of the shit he had done leading up to the Fourth Shinobi War, and even that half-hearted, almost immediately thwarted plot to assassinate the Gokage, but he had still done wrong by a lot of people. Maybe he'd had his reasons at the time, but the man he was now refused to forgive himself all of the awful things his younger self had done. He had to live with his mistakes, and try to make up for his many transgressions. He did his best to remember all of the wrongs he had done, chiefly so he would never go off and do them again. He lost his arm trying to kill Naruto, his best friend. In Sasuke's opinion, replacing that arm would be like saying it no longer mattered that he had attempted to murder one of the only people to keep faith in him all the way up to the bitter end. Naruto had believed in him, and done his damnedest to save Sasuke from his inner demons even when the Uchiha had personally been doing his college best to rip out the Uzumaki's throat. He had tried to kill Naruto with his left arm. He had attempted to commit an unforgivable sin with that hand. Dimly, he remembered hearing a bit of foreign scripture in his post-war travels that spoke of cutting off any part of yourself that caused you to sin, saying that it was better to go into paradise a cripple than to suffer eternal damnation fully intact. Sasuke didn't know about anything else that monk had said, but that much at least had rung true with him. So much so that he had almost attempted to pluck out his own eyes then and there. The holy man had been highly disturbed by this, apparently having meant his sermon in a much less literal sense than Sasuke had taken it, and only reluctantly had the Uchiha listened to the man's request to please not mutilate himself right in front of the children. Whatever his ultimate reasoning, though, Sasuke had stubbornly refused to ever replace the arm he had lost. No matter how hard his friends tried to convince him otherwise. And on at least one memorable occasion, his wife had even secretly grafted on a new arm in his sleep. It had taken the hungover Sasuke half the day to realize what Sakura had done, that time, and when he did he'd irritably ripped the arm off at the elbow and flung it aside. Much to the visiting daimyo's distress. So, feeling this new replacement arm, Sasuke figured that Sakura or Naruto had probably taken another shot at convincing him to replace his missing hand. He did not appreciate the gesture. "Damn it, you guys," he muttered, irritably grabbing the offending limb in his hand. "What part of, I don't want a new arm, can't you understand?" Casually, and effortlessly, Sasuke flicked his wrist and ripped off this most recent replacement limb. It took him a second to register the blood. And by the time he did, the blinding pain was almost bad enough to keep him from focusing long enough to cauterize the wound with an emergency Kaguchochi. Well, that was unexpected. Sakura was the first one to realize she had traveled back in time. Mostly because 1. She had woken up in a bed only big enough for one. 2. She appeared to have been sleeping in her childhood bedroom. 3. Her childhood home had been destroyed by Pain's big-ass Shinra Tensei over a decade ago. 4. Even if that house and her bedroom had still been intact and standing, her childhood bedroom should have felt much smaller to her adult self. And 5. Her chest was completely devoid of anything even remotely resembling actual boobs. This last detail was the most telling, because while it was possible that someone could have built a perfect replica of her childhood bedroom and scaled it up to freak her out, which sounded like just the kind of collaborative prank that Naruto, Sai, and Ino might pull off if they were feeling especially bored, Sakura felt reasonably certain she would have noticed undergoing any kind of breast reduction surgery. Also, whatever this was, it sure as hell wasn't a genjutsu. She'd had enough kinky illusion sex with her husband in his Tsukuyomi to know most intimately when something was and wasn't real. So, adding all of these details together, and taking a peek at the calendar just to be sure, Sakura felt it was pretty safe to say that she had somehow traveled back in time. And judging by the almost complete flatness of her chest, she reckoned that her current body was somewhere around 12 or 13. Fortunately, her chakra reserves seemed to be completely intact, or else this could have been a very bad thing. As it was, Sakura just hoped she wasn't the only one to have wound up in the past, or else this was going to be a very long, very boring wait. Hinata was immediately aware of one thing when she woke up. Her husband was not in bed next to her. Activating her Byakugan, she saw that he also wasn't anywhere in the house. Also, that this wasn't their house. Half asleep and distinctly horny, Hinata felt exceptionally grateful in advance for being married to one of the most vigorous and generous lovers alive. She also felt very little patience for anyone who might try to get in between her and her husband. Hinata's feelings for Naruto had strongly defined a considerable portion of her life. Her admiration for his determined spirit had led her to try and improve and overcome her own weakness. Her love for him had led her to take action multiple times in her teenage years, where she otherwise would have stood aside and let someone else come to the rescue. And the mature, more erotic love she felt for Naruto as his wife had let the former Hyuga heiress overcome much of her old shyness and bashfulness. She was by no means without shame or restraint, but when it came to her husband she could be shockingly bold. Which is probably why the first thing Hinata did upon standing up from her futon was to blow through the nearest wall with an overpowered vacuum palm. And also why the second thing she did was to stalk off the premises of the Hyuga manor, heading as the crow flies straight towards the unmistakable beacon of her husband's chakra. The fact that this entailed blasting her way through many more walls and branch house members, while dressed in nothing but her, admittedly conservative, pajamas, did not bother her in the slightest. Hinata Uzumaki had pined over a decade for Naruto before he had finally come to reciprocate her feelings. She was not about to let anything keep her from seeking him out and showing him her love. Over and over and over again. Good news, I'm still in Konoha. This was Naruto's first thought after stumbling his way, half-naked, out of that vaguely familiar apartment. He still felt dreadfully hungover, and the open sunlight was like a pair of red-hot daggers being stabbed into his skull. He was distracted from the murderous headache, however, stupid Kurama never letting him use his chakra to fix those fucking hangovers, grumble, by the sight of the Hokage monument. Bad news? There were only 4 faces. It looks like I'm in the past. He pinched the bridge of his nose. God fucking damn it. This realization naturally put the Lord 7th Hokage in an extremely foul mood. He had sealed away all those alleged time travel jutsu scrolls for a very good reason. I better not be the only one here. He muttered, dressed in just boxers and an undershirt, looking down irritably at his much scrawnier 12-year-old body. Had he ever actually been this small? It seemed inconceivable. He was then distracted from his thoughts by a very familiar flare of distinctive fire chakra roughly in the direction of Sasuke's old apartment. It was quite small, considering the sort of things Sasuke usually broke that jutsu out for. Probably no more than a little flicker of flame. And it disappeared almost immediately too. Humming thoughtfully, Naruto noticed that Sasuke seemed to be in a good deal of pain, physical rather than emotional, for once, although there was a much smaller degree of distress directly associated to that sudden spike of ow. Cocking an eye curiously, Naruto then zoomed in on Sakura's signature. She seemed mildly annoyed, but it was well within the standard deviation. People got annoyed all the time over little, meaningless things. Often when dealing with him. Naruto was perfectly accustomed to that sort of feedback, and it didn't raise any of his eyebrows. Something he did notice, however, was a not-so-distant growing throng of slight surprise and confusion, along with a very familiar flavor of desire attached to a chakra signature he knew as well as that of his own kids. Despite their current circumstances, Naruto couldn't help the cheerful grin that came onto his face. He could tear a new one out of whatever asshole had landed them in the past later. For now, however, he had a frustrated wife in need of some stress relief. And he could do with blowing off some irritation, too. "Hello, dear," Naruto said to Hinata Uzumaki ne Hyuga. "How are you feeling?" The 12 or 13-year-old Hinata gave her 12 or so year old husband a curious, but also intense, look. "Naruto?" she said wonderingly, having long ago dropped the kun honorific. If there was anyone she could reasonably address with the intimacy of a first-name basis, it was the Lord 7th Hokage and father of her children. Naruto's sweat dropped, seeing the befuddled expression on his wife's face. "Yeah, it looks like we're in the past," he commented. Hinata frowned. "So? Boruto and him are wary," she murmured, her expression falling. Naruto winced. He squinted, looking a touch anxious. "Yeah. I'm sure we can find a way back, but..." Hinata smiled softly. "They'll be all right for a little while," she whispered. "Until we can return to our own time, at least." Naruto grinned, and took his wife's hand. "Yeah, until then," he murmured. Then his expression turned foxy, and he grinned at Hinata. "Want to go inside, my dear?" he said with a playful wink. Hinata giggled, and batted her eyes at him. But of course," she said in a tone that would have been quite husky if her present body were capable of producing such sounds. Naruto picked her up in a bridal carry, and brought her in over the threshold. 10 minutes later, a very angry and flustered-looking Naruto stormed right back out of his apartment. He was fully dressed, now, glaring down at his own crotch, and radiating a generous amount of killing intent. Those inhabiting the floors below him in the apartment complex promptly experienced an inexplicable, simultaneous loosening of their bowels. One particularly elderly tenant even suffered a brief heart attack, though fortunately it was while their children were visiting, and thus able to get them immediate medical attention. Hinata came out of the apartment a moment later, still dressed in her conservative, unrevealing night clothes. She was smiling weakly at Naruto, and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, dear," she said softly. "I hear it happens to most men now and then." Naruto spared a forced smile for his wife, before glaring once more down at his groin. His eye twitched. "I'm gonna kill whoever got us thrown back in time," he growled. "Fuck causality, fuck the laws of nature. I don't even care about that garbage anymore, multiverse theory or some shit, I don't know." He threw his head back, then, tearing out fistfuls of his hair and screaming in frustration. "But I am not going through puberty again." Chapter 2, like an old married couple. Sigh. "What am I going to do with you, Sasuke?" These were the first words the Uchiha heard upon his return to consciousness, after drifting in a haze of blinding pain for an indeterminate length of time. Ripping off that prosthetic arm had apparently not been such a good idea, considering how the blood proceeded to get everywhere. "I should be asking you that, Han," Sasuke chuckled weakly, grinning at the face of his wife. His vision was still a touch blurry from the tears that welled up in response to the inexplicable agony which shot up from the stump of his arm, but he would have recognized that shade of pink anywhere. He felt his wife's chakra fluctuate by the most microscopic fraction of a percentage as she flicked one of her hands over a badly charred elbow. As he blinked the saline out of his eyes, he could begin to make out the minuscule chakra scalpels which delicately chipped away at the burnt tissue, surgically excising the useless flesh a tiny bit at a time whilst simultaneously exhorting the healthy cells to split up and replace the damaged ones. No matter how many times he watched Sakura at work, Sasuke could never get over how damned hypnotic her medical jutsu was. It was entrancing in a way he couldn't really explain. His Sharingan, as a tipsy Kano Amaru had once famously dubbed it, let him see the finest details of her mystic palm technique, and the infinite subtlety of Sakura's chakra control never ceased to fascinate him. It was one of the odder reasons to find a woman attractive, he supposed, but something about Sakura's medical ninjutsu just left Sasuke Uchiha all but completely incapable of tearing his eyes away. He marveled at her skill, the absolute confidence and precision with which she worked. His visual prowess gave Sasuke an aesthetic appreciation for his wife's medical skills that surpassed even the pragmatic gratefulness for her healing abilities. Her every motion was exactly as she meant it to be, her chakra doing nothing she did not will it to. It was sublime. Watching Sakura do her thing as a medic was like watching one of the Renaissance masters at work. She had absolute control of her hands and her chakra. Like what you see? Sakura teased her husband, seeing his eyes on her hands, which also meant that his gaze just so happened to be on level with her chest. Sasuke blinked, then, suddenly realizing something. Hearing Sakura's voice a second time, he now had the clarity of mind to perceive a curious oddity. She didn't have the subtle rasp, or slightest purring tenor she had come to possess as a mature, fully grown woman. The oral texture of her voice was less rich than Sasuke was accustomed to, less aged and refined. He heard less of a resonance in her torso, less depth and richness in her tone. If Sasuke didn't know any better, he would have said it sounded almost like Sakura was. He blinked again, his eyes flicking momentarily from Sakura's hands. He stared at his wife's chest for several silent seconds. Huh, he said at length, staring at what should have been at least a modest swell. I know I said I liked them on the smaller side anyways, but, what happened to your breasts? The same thing that has happened to your little Kusanagi, I'm sure, said Sakura frankly, smiling down at her husband. Sasuke's eyes wandered up from his wife's presently non-existent rack, and he stared blankly at her face. Particularly her forehead, which appeared to be completely devoid of something to which he had become very accustomed over the years. And the same as what's happened to your seal of 100 strengths? He wondered. A beat. Sakura's previous state emerald finally got through his skull, and Sasuke's Sharingan/Rinnegan combo widened. Wait, he said, his voice sounding far more high-pitched than it should have in his sudden distress. What's happened to my penis? Sakura smiled sheepishly at her husband. I'd say, about -23 years, she quipped. Ko was a member of the Hyuga clan's branch house. He was adequately skilled with the gentle fist, and possessed a Byakugan of average strength. In no way was he terribly remarkable, save perhaps that he was one of the younger branch house members currently in active service. Neji was younger still, of course, but the young teen was also Ko's superior in skill. Plus he rather vehemently and openly loathed the main house of the Hyuga, so there were naturally certain duties that could not exactly be entrusted to him. This was not to say, of course, that Neji was the only cadet branch member to dislike the main branch. Bitter feelings ran deep between the two houses of the Hyuga clan, and many of the lesser clansmen fairly resented their treatment at the hands of the few, elite main branch members. Ko himself had enough reason to mutter darkly about the clan elders and their policies, and he was not exactly the clan head's biggest fan. But he was also a reasonable, responsible young man. He did not begrudge the duties laid at his feet as a member of the branch house. The basic idea was little different from what most shinobi did for the village, and he took a small amount of pride in the thought of being trusted to protect the secrets of the Byakugan from those who might try to steal it. Dying for the sake of the clan was a noble, even admirable act. Most Hyuga, branch house, or main, would say that such a death would be a good one. This was something both parties agreed on. The caged bird seal was unpleasant, perhaps, inasmuch as the fact that it basically served as a convenient kill switch for uppity branch house members, but keeping the clan's Kekai Genkai from being stolen by ambitious corpse robbers was a high priority. The seal's main purpose was to destroy all genetic markers involved in activating the Byakugan, as well as sealing away the eyes themselves. This much, at least, was reasonable. Many clans had similar procedures for eliminating any biological traces of their secret arts or bloodline limits. If there was any chance of enemies being able to get their hands on a corpse, it was standard procedure to destroy any and all evidence that might enable people to reverse engineer the techniques or medications which empowered their shinobi. Frying the brain with a hand seal was technically just a side effect of the caged bird seal's original, primary purpose. While this side effect had been used in the past to keep members of the branch house in line, KO and most of his peers also knew that even the most hardline, callous sobs in the main branch frowned heavily on the careless use of that particular feature. Even if they were expected to live out almost the entirety of their natural lives as meat shields and body doubles for the chosen few elite, kin were still kin. The Hyuga, being a very old and powerful family, were every bit as clannish as the Uchiha or Senju. Binding the majority of their relatives with powerful, brain-nuking curse seals was not that much worse than some of the other traditions to have survived from the Warring States era. With the exception of a few unfortunate souls like Neji, most cadet branch Hyuga could accept the caged bird seal, and the role as expendable shields to protect the main branch. They were a ninja clan, after all, such things were an integral facet of their existence. Where KO and many other branch house members drew the line, however, were things like this. Hinata-sama, please return home with me. Your father would like a word with you. KO looked at the girl with a grimace, hoping she didn't notice the slight shiver that raced through him when she returned his glance, or hear the faint whimper that he couldn't quite manage to choke back when she smiled at him. It was always the nice, quiet ones, wasn't it? When they snapped hard. And, considering the swathe of destruction Hinata had carved on her way out of the Hyuga estate, KO felt fairly justified in his assessment that the poor thing had finally cracked under the pressure. A part of him pitied her, knowing how much stress the lass had been under to try and meet her father's expectations. The rest of him was absolutely terrified. Sure, up until today Hinata had seemed like the kindest, gentlest, most innocent, and harmless little girl ever, but they said Itachi had seemed like a nice kid too, and look where he wound up. As Hyuga went, KO was not remarkable in any way. He was of average height, average build, average skill, and average looks. If you were to chart all the various aspects of Hyuga clan members and draw up a theoretical median for each of their different traits, the overall result would probably look a lot like KO. Basically, he was just one step up from nameless fodder. He had about as much character as a Star Trek redshirt, and roughly equivalent chances of surviving any kind of serious shit. If so much as a gentle breeze wafted through the Hyuga estate, KO would be one of the first casualties. He was completely expendable, and he damn well knew it. Which was probably why he was mentally cursing Hayashi and his ancestors to the 7th generation, which also happened to include a number of KO's own predecessors, as he valiantly tried to convince the seemingly snapped Hinata to return with him peacefully to the manor. Hopefully, she wouldn't decide to kill him too painfully. Sasuke stared at his wife. It took him several long minutes to process what she was saying. What? His words were as flat as his wife's chest, his expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. We're in the past, dear, Sakura repeated more explicitly. Back to about the age of 12, if my calendar is right. Which it probably is, seeing how fastidious I've always been about such things. Sasuke blinked owlishly. He sat up in his bed, looking down blankly at the stump of his left arm. Well, that certainly explains the blood, he said blandly. And the pain. He looked over at the freshly discarded arm which lay at the foot of his dresser. The skin was pale, and the amount of blood on the floor and the upholstery would probably mean hours of cleaning. Sasuke's bedsheets were thankfully much less red, a quick and almost reflexive application of his EMS flame control having stemmed the blood loss mere fractions of a second after it had started. Yes, it does, said Sakura, audibly tooting at her husband's impulsiveness. That wasn't a prosthetic. Not that you should have ripped it off even if it was one. The Uchiha clan had at least had the decency to look vaguely contrite. I never would have expected to wake up in the past, he commented. It's hard to believe what you're saying. I probably wouldn't, if not for certain pieces of evidence. He glanced again at his wife's chest. Do you have any idea how this might have happened? Sakura shook her head. No, and I'm not sure who else might have come back with us, either, she said, before pausing and frowning worriedly. "Er. You know, assuming we're not the only ones who've come back in time." She didn't sound very hopeful in that regard. Sasuke hummed thoughtfully. He glanced around his room for a moment, before nodding his head and speaking up again. "Naruto's a given, at least," he said. "I just know that, somehow or other, this has something to do with him." "A beat." Sakura chuckled wryly, nodding in agreement as she wrapped some gauze around the stump of Sasuke's arm. "He does have a habit of winding up at the center of these kinds of things, doesn't he?" she mused. Hinata stared at the branch house clan member who had just come running up to her. He was shaking like a leaf and sweating bullets, talking to her like one might talk to a rabid dog they all but knew was going to bite them. She frowned subtly, detecting that Naruto had inched sideways from her as well. In his case, of course, he was clearly trying to act inconspicuous and make it look like his presence here next to the Hyuga clan's present heiress was just an innocent coincidence. Logically, Hinata understood why her husband would want to try and avoid complicating matters by letting on that he was in a relationship with her, since originally at this point in time Naruto had barely even registered her existence. It still irked her a little, though. While she was sympathetic to her husband's earlier plight in the bedroom, and could tend to herself well enough until such a time as he was able to resume his marital duties, that didn't mean she liked the thought of having to distance herself from him. She'd already earned her happy ending, damn it. She didn't want to go through the motions all over again until such a time as they could reasonably get back together without drawing any undue attention from the wrong people. "So, if you would please be so kind, Hinata-sama." Ko was stammering, trying futilely to coax the clan heiress into coming back to the estate with him. It was a rather pathetic sight, honestly. Hinata frowned. Inwardly, she felt a tiny bit sheepish. Knowing now that she was in the past, it made sense that certain of her actions that morning may have led her family to make particular wild assumptions. In this time she wasn't known as the 7th Hokage's wife, Konoha's very own Yamato Nadeshiko incarnate. She was just a delicate wallflower, here, a quiet and insecure young kunoichi who also unfortunately had the weight of the Hyuga clan shoved onto her shoulders by a miserable accident of birth. Feeling the slightest hint of irritation, Hinata grabbed her husband by the collar. He had been trying to skulk off, which was a perfectly sensible course of action in this instance, but Hinata was not feeling particularly sensible at the moment. Unconsciously, and unintentionally, Hinata let loose a tiny bit of killing intent in silent frustration, yanking Naruto closer. Compared to what she could do if she got serious, the bloodlust she projected right now was barely the lightest tickling of a feather on the back of one's neck. Relatively speaking. Objectively, seeing as how this was a kunoichi on par with the best of the best, in combat ability and mastery of her arts able to rival the likes of Itachi Uchiha or Kakashi Hatake in their prime, it was still some damn serious sake. Ko, the poor fellow, very nearly pissed his pants. Sasuke looked at himself in the mirror, Sakura standing a little ways off behind him. He could not help but be amazed at how young they both looked. Aside from his now missing left arm, and Sakura's now sensibly trimmed hair, the two have looked remarkably like the fresh genin in their old team photo. Well, aside from Sasuke's Sharingan, and their overall demeanor, as well. She was more sure and confident in her poise, where he was more laid back and mellow. Neither of them was the same person they had been when last they were at this young age. Time had changed them, time, and hardship, and Naruto Uzumaki. They were adults, full-grown shinobi. Parents. "I hope Sarada is doing okay without us," Sasuke whispered, staring at the reflection of his face. He could see his daughter in so many aspects of his youthful visage, in his cheekbones, his chin, and the shape of his eyes. A part of him wondered, idly, whether she had indeed inherited the genes for these eyes, the Sharingan which blazed back at him from his reflection. Another part of him hoped she hadn't, hoped that she could live a happy and peaceful life without ever having to worry about feeling too much, without ever having to fear the descent into madness which would surely come if she lost the ones most precious to her. He wished he could have many children, give his daughter many little brothers and sisters to dote on and play with and tease. Sakura had broached the subject with him more than once, but every time she had raised the possibility, his mind's eye had flooded with images of his own family, of himself and Itachi, and the bloody, twisted cords of love and hatred which had bound their fates together. And every time, without fail, he would feel the burning in his eyes, the tears of blood flowing down his cheeks, and know that no matter what else he did, he could never let himself subject his precious, beloved daughter to those same vile temptations which had nearly destroyed his clan and driven him into the deepest depths of darkness. I hope that multiverse theory is accurate, Sakura added, seeing the emotions which flickered across her husband's face. Or else, she might already no longer exist. She glanced meaningfully at Sasuke's missing arm, and he scowled. It better be accurate, the Uchiha clan head growled. Because I won't hesitate to rip the space-time continuum apart at the seams if it means getting to see her again. Sakura nodded, and silently prayed that it wouldn't come to that. Considering the level of power he and Naruto wielded, Sasuke's threat was hardly idle. Until then, though, she said, interrupting her love's dark thoughts, would you be a dear and help me reapply my yin seal? Considering the changes you've already made, I suppose it probably can't hurt to be prepared. Sasuke looked sidelong at his wife, smiling softly. How long do you think it will take you to charge it up? He asked her. Sakura waved a hand dismissively. Our chakra came back with our minds, she said. We may be in our 12-year-old bodies, but we have all the control and capacity that we did as adults. It should only take me a week or so to fill up my Byakugan no into a workable level. And that's pumping her up from scratch, mind you. Sasuke nodded. Fair enough, he said. That's pretty convenient. Explains how you could rip your arm right off, too, Sakura added. You have the same control as your future self, so it's a simple matter to unconsciously boost your physical capabilities with precision chakra manipulation. Sasuke smiled, and glanced around thoughtfully. Yeah. He murmured. A pause. Say, have you got a sealing brush on you? Sakura nodded, even as she started to disrobe. Naruto briefly considered making a break for it. He only dimly recognized the person standing before him and Hinata thanks to the strong family resemblance between Hyuga, but he was fairly sure that whoever this guy was, he would not be happy if he found out what he and Hinata had just been doing in his apartment. Or, well, trying to do, anyways. It seemed that the 7th Hokage hadn't quite hit puberty yet at this point in time, much to his continuing frustration. But, still. While Naruto only had a very general recollection of his childhood, he did remember well enough that most people had not liked him. It was debatable whether the member of a shinobi clan like the Hyuga would be so uninformed as to mistake the jail for its prisoner, but he hadn't exactly done anything to endear himself to them yet in this timeline. Well, aside from Hinata, according to what his wife had told him of her childhood admiration for him, but that wouldn't exactly fix his problem. Son of the Yondaime or not, Naruto was pretty sure that the Hayashi of this time was not about to smile and tearfully give his blessing to him and Hinata. So, quietly, trying to make himself seem as innocent and unimportant as possible, Naruto started to tiptoe away from Hinata and her relative. He made it about 3 steps before he felt his wife's hand on his collar. With a yelp, he was tugged back to Hinata's side, and she fixed him with a meaningful look which told him very clearly that she was not in the mood to be dealing with this shit on her own. Ah, sorry. Naruto mumbled sheepishly. He looked at Ko. What can I do for you this fine day, Hyuga-san? He flashed a weak smile at the probable branch house member, a bit of sweat trickling down his brow. The young man blinked, and did a double take. WH. What are you doing here? He yelped, sounding more tense than anything. I live here, Naruto said lamely, pointing at the apartment door behind him. The Hyuga blinked again, and turned to stare at Hinata. His expression was a curious mix of dismay, disbelief, and utter discombobulation. What? I live here, Naruto repeated for the man's benefit. This is my apartment. He paused, inwardly furrowing his brow as he silently added. I think. So what day is today, anyways? Sasuke asked Sakura, once he'd finished applying the formula for the 100 strength seal to her body. If we're in the past. He may not have had Naruto's knack for Fuinjutsu, the blonde having spent many years studying those arts in order to live up to the considerable reputation of his clan, but Sasuke was still nonetheless pretty skilled at sealing, if he did say so himself. And he was also doing a very good job of neither getting too aroused or too weirded out by his wife's mostly naked form beneath him. Jutsu formula sealing script, runes, and written ley lines, gleamed and sparked as they crawled over Sakura's skin. Artistic tendrils of ink swayed and writhed to and fro over the kunoichi's bare flesh, glowing and glimmering as the whole spider web of writing slowly retreated to the single drop of blood which had been precisely smeared over her Ajna chakra. Sasuke watched almost boredly, detaching himself from the fact that this was his beautiful and loving wife's practically naked, 12-year-old body that he had just finished writing on and around. The ritual circle on his bedroom floor flashed as it drew Sasuke's chakra from the seal, letting Sakura's energies fill the writing up in its stead. In a matter of seconds, the whole array which Sasuke had painstakingly scrawled onto Sakura's body had receded up into her forehead, the entire jutsu formula compressed into a singular point. The smear of blood on Sakura's brow melted away, and her skin was bare once again. Sakura relaxed, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A smile quirked her lips, and she beamed up at her husband. Her chest heaved with heavy breaths, the girl visibly worn out from the process of applying the seal. In time, her naked brow would bear the diamond mark indicative of a Byakugan no in at functioning capacity. According to the calendar in my room, today's the day Kakashi-sensei gives us the bell test, the young woman said, panting and sweaty, her skin flushed in a manner that was rather inappropriately suggestive of certain other activities which could be done in her present, nigh non-existent state of dress. Sasuke blushed, and he wasn't sure whether to be thankful or dismayed that he didn't feel any immediate stirring below the belt. Then he blinked, his brain belatedly processing what Sakura had actually said. Ah. I see. And what time is it? He wondered. Earlier than Kakashi-sensei would be there, Sakura drawled. Sasuke checked his clock. It said 8:24 a.m. Oh, yeah. We still have another couple of hours, at least, he mused. Nodding, he then added, do you think we should go see if Naruto came back with us? Sakura smiled slyly at her husband. At least give me time to get dressed, dear, she said. Unless you want me to visit him practically naked. Her teasing colored Sasuke's face, and he spluttered sheepishly. All right, he mumbled, blushing hotly at the thought. Sure, go ahead and get dressed. Just don't take too long, okay? Sakura smirked. I make no promises, she said. A woman has to look her best, no matter where it is she's going. As long as you don't spend an hour putting on makeup, Sasuke replied, the redness fading. We don't need to be arriving even later than Kakashi. Sakura rolled her eyes, letting out a most unladylike snort. Oh, please. That was one time, and he was already there in the first place. It was his wedding, after all. Really? And how about Yamato's wedding? Okay, 2 times. But it's not like you've never gotten us late for anything, mister. I'll take as much time in the shower as I need to wash my hair, Sakura drawled. Does Naruto's inauguration ring a bell? Long hair requires a lot of care. Sasuke replied defensively. He almost looked like he was about to start sulking. Besides, the way I remember it, you're the one who suggested it'd look good if I let my hair grow out. And it did look good, Sakura said with a smirk, her eyes glinting. Now if only we could do something about that left arm of yours. Sasuke was the one to roll his eyes, this time. I can do everything you need with just the one, he said, smirking suggestively at his wife. Emerald eyes glinted, meeting Sasuke's heterochromatic orbs with a hungry gleam. Oh ho! She purred. And are you of a mind to prove that little boast? Sasuke smirked, and his eyes lit up. I'll do more than just prove it, he said with a husky growl. Clothes went flying everywhere, and 2 youthful bodies, oh godly flashbacks repress, fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Ko blinked. He stared at Naruto. Dimly, he recalled that there was something important about the boy, but all he could think at the moment was a flat, toneless what. He stared at Hinata, blinking owlishly as he tried to process what Naruto had just said. It did not escape his notice that the clan heiress's pajamas looked a little messy, or that he had seen her and Naruto emerge from the very same apartment the blonde had pointed to. It was not outside the notice of the girl's family that she had often taken to covertly watching the Uzumaki boy train. She had been quietly following the lad around for a few years now, having what seemed to be an innocent, precocious crush on the rather infamous prankster. Ko had often been assigned to watching Hinata while she was out, covertly following the heiress to make sure nobody tried to pull off a repeat of that hidden cloud fiasco. While he was aloof and demanding, Hayashi-sama did worry about the girl's well-being, and was very clear on making sure that she was properly supervised within the village limits. Ko had as such more than once watched the girl watch Naruto. Most clan members who cared to discuss such matters were at least distantly aware of the nominal heiress's fondness for Naruto Uzumaki. And while a modestly sizable portion quietly disapproved of this, most of the rest were ambivalent, or even found it cute. Ko, for what it's worth, was in the third category. He understood his role as a member of the branch house, and accepted his duty in preserving the Hyuga clan's prosperity. He would give his life to protect the village his family called home, sacrifice his eyes and his freedom if that would keep the enemy from stealing the clan secrets. He respected the respective roles of the main and cadet branches. This did not mean, however, that he particularly liked the clan head. Hayashi was a stern man, and while he meant well enough, his attitude could still rub people the wrong way. He was also very protective of his daughter, and would probably kill anyone who dared to defile her at such a young age as this. Ko secretly imagined that Hayashi would probably have a heart attack if he found out that the Uzumaki brat, whom Ko distantly recalled as being bad news in some vague manner or other, had seemingly willfully fornicated with his 12-year-old daughter. And while it might have been worth a laugh just to see what colors the man's face would turn, it would probably be better for all involved if this little incident was kept from the clan head's attention. For Hinata as much as anyone else. Ko didn't pretend to understand why the girl had snapped that morning, but she looked relatively non-violent now, and if the fact that she wasn't currently flinging him through the air like a rag doll could be attributed to anything the blonde prankster had done, well, Ko could look the other way. Just this once. If you come with me, Hinata-sama, he said slowly, carefully, I'm sure we can forget all about whatever has happened here. It was a gamble. If Hinata was actually still snapped, then words would be useless. But if she was in a state where she could be reasoned with. Ko only barely avoided having a heart attack when the girl smiled at him. Very well, she said uncharacteristically primly. I will permit you to. For a moment it sounded like she was suppressing a laugh. Walk me home. Hinata finished, her eyes glinting with something Ko decided he really did not want to try and identify. Coughing anxiously, the Hyuga branch member spared one last curious glance for Naruto Uzumaki, before shaking his head and gesturing for Hinata to follow him. He did not notice the pair brushing their fists together for a split second. For an instant, it seemed like time had frozen for the boy and girl. But then they smiled at one another, and nodded in understanding. See ya later, Hinata-chan. Naruto chirped, doing his best to approximate the way he had spoken in his youth. That would be lovely, Naruto-kun, Hinata replied, mostly for Ko's benefit. Naruto waved goodbye, and Hinata followed after Ko. Inside the Uzumaki's belly, Kurama resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Humans, he mentally scoffed. They're even worse than rabbits. He was grinning, though. Omaka. Sasuke and Sakura's bedtime woes. Sasuke looked at Sakura. Sakura looked at Sasuke. They were lying in the Uchiha's bed, naked as the day they were born, both frowning irritably. Though their skin was rosy and flush with sweat beneath the covers, their youthful bodies aching and burning, they looked neither excited nor satisfied. Okay, this is just painful, Sakura conceded. And not even in the fun way. Are you sure you remember what you're doing, dear? Strange, Sasuke murmured. I know it hasn't been more than a week since the last time we've done it. And I'm not really feeling anything, either. It's just, sort of awkward and vaguely uncomfortable. You can barely get it up, at that, Sakura deadpanned, her eyes half-lidded. Not in a sexy or suggestive way, either. I swear this has never happened to me before, Sasuke insisted defensively. Sakura sighed. Let's just go get Naruto. All right, dear. Sasuke pouted, looking deeply affronted by his present difficulties. Fine. Let's just get dressed and go meet him. Chapter 3, Kurenai doesn't know what to think. Kurenai Yuhi awkwardly shifted a standard issue flak vest over her torso, feeling dreadfully compressed under the drat thing. She could hardly breathe in the dim vest, but she wanted to look good and professional for this meeting. The things women sacrificed for their careers. Still, though, this was like wearing a bloody corset, and Kurenai could not help but feel uncomfortably aware of the numerous Byakugan eyes on her as she strolled up into the Hyuga estate. The part of her that was still an insecure young teenager wanted to cover herself and squeal pervert. At all the bulging veins and suspiciously pale eyes, even though the more logical, mature parts of her psyche scoffed at the idea of getting so worked up over the notion of being peeped on. They lived in a ninja village, after all. Umbu knew the color of every last villager's mourning constitutional, and privacy was one of the first luxuries a shinobi would learn to sacrifice on long-term missions. Separating yourself from the rest of the squad just to bathe, change clothes, or relieve yourself was just asking for trouble. How could you trust your teammates with your life if you couldn't even trust them enough not to stress out over being seen naked? That was a lesson every halfway decent kunoichi had to learn. It was a good lesson for male ninja, too, at that. Of course, there was that saying about what was okay on a mission not necessarily being okay in the village, but still. Kurenai shook her head. Trying to take her mind off of the painfully squished state of her chest, the illusion mistress glanced curiously at the tumbled wreckage of a nearby wall. Plaster dust, chunks of masonry, and snapped wooden beams were all heaped at the foot of a gaping hole. It reminded her a little of Asuma's first few tries at getting his burning ash jutsu down, minus the smoke and glowing cinders. Branch house members scurried this way and that across the grounds. They carried building supplies and measuring tools, a nervous tension in the air as they murmured and gossiped. Kurenai caught a few brief snatches of their hushed conversations, listening in out of idle curiosity more than anything else. Yeah, he just woke up in the infirmary, and the first thing he did. Says it's looking like over 300,000 ryo, as far as damages. I caught a glimpse of her, right after it happened. She looked like a thing possessed. Just know this is coming out of my pension, should have invested in stocks. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? Who would have thought she could? It would be untrue for Kurenai to say that she was not curious about what could have happened here. She was frankly gobsmacked to see the extent of the damages. The Hyuga estate looked like it had been hit by a herd of stampeding buffalo. It was troubling on one level, though also amusing on another. She had never exactly cared for the more stuck-up sorts who tended to populate these old, wealthy bloodline clans, but one of her new students did live here. It would be a shame if anything had happened to her. Hinata seemed like such a nice girl. Excuse me, Kurenai said to a passing clansman. Would you happen to know where Hayashi-san is? I am here to talk with him about his daughter. Team 8 had passed their true genin test with flying colors the day before, and Kurenai was honestly eager to start them on missions. Her nomination for Jonin promotion had only recently gone through, and this would be her first time training a genin squad. She heard Kakashi had put off on testing his team, the slacker. A more sadistic part of the woman couldn't wait to see how the kids reacted to their first D-rank missions. If she'd had to suffer through them, then so would her students. That was one rite of passage she would be very happy to continue, now that she was the Jonin sensei who got to sit back, kick her feet up, and watch the newbie genin do all the dirty work. Busy with thoughts of how Kiba in particular would respond to his first job as a ninja, not that she had anything against him, mind you, the loudmouth Inyazuka would just doubtless have the most entertaining reaction. Kurenai almost missed the Hyuga blanching at her question. Ah, he said, gulping nervously. So you're here about Hinata-sama. Even if Kurenai hadn't been a seasoned, elite shinobi, she still would have seen the obvious anxiety in this individual's posture. He looked as white as death, and was frozen stiff. His tone of voice had traces of fear, and his eyes flicked nervously to one side. I'm her Jonin instructor, she told the man, who looked like he might have been pushing 50. Hinata is a genin now, and there are certain things I will need to clear with her father before I can begin the girls' training. The Hyuga, who, judging by the absence of any markings on his bare forehead was probably a minor member of the main branch, nodded his head weakly, staring off into the distance and avoiding meeting Kurenai's eyes. Yes, of course, he said distractedly, and if Kurenai had thought it were possible at this point, she would have sworn that he had somehow gone even paler. I will fetch Hayashi-sama for you. Please wait here, ah. Kurenai Yuhi, she provided. Yuhi-san, yes, the Hyuga said, nodding again, with a distant look in his eyes. I thought you looked familiar. Yes. I will tell him you are here. And then the man turned and scurried off, looking like he had a rabid ninja hound snapping at his heels. Kurenai watched him go for a few seconds, curious as to why the man was acting so skittish. After a moment's thought, she shook her head and dismissed the matter, taking another look at her surroundings. Surveying the grounds of the manor absent-mindedly, she noticed that most of the damage seemed to have been done in a straight line. It looked almost like someone had just waltzed right on through the heavily warded walls and dozens of Hyuga guards. Kurenai cocked an eyebrow, unsure whether to feel curious or worried. She had seen blast-style experts from Iwa who left less destruction in their wake. Either there had been some kind of freak accident involving a 10-pound crate of explosive notes, or a medium-large size summon had plowed right through the estate. The level of destruction before her eyes was honestly impressive. Idly wondering what could have happened here to have caused so much damage without warranting direct intervention from the Umbu, Kurenai once more shuffled her flak vest over a frame which had grown well beyond the uniform's original measurements in certain areas. If Kurenai ever found out who had gotten the bright idea to base standard flak vest sizes on male body types, she would have a few choice words for them. And people wondered why most kunoichi didn't wear these damn things. Kurenai blinked, then, distracted from her irritated reverie, she turned her head to see the head of the Hyuga clan coming towards her. Hayashi's face was unreadable as he approached, and Kurenai greeted him with a short, perfunctory half-bow. Hello, Hayashi-san, she said. May I have a word with you? It's about your daughter's promotion to genin. Hayashi nodded absent-mindedly, and when he looked at her, he seemed to be staring off into the distance. Yes, of course, he said distractedly. Hinata's promotion. I hope there haven't been any problems. The way he said problems raised one of Kurenai's eyebrows, but she shook her head. No, nothing like that, she told him. It's mostly just a formality, but she is heiress apparent, and so I will need your express permission regarding certain matters. Yes, Hayashi mumbled, nodding. Of course. Come, let us speak inside. He gestured vaguely for Kurenai to follow him, and she did. It was with a grin on his face and a skip in his step that Naruto Uzumaki strolled back inside his apartment. Having enjoyed a nice long mental conversation/planning session with his wife, he was in a good mood, and feeling much less worried about screwing things up. Rarely had the blonde felt more grateful to his past/future/other self for taking the time and effort to reverse engineer the principles of old man Rakuto's ninju. He'd actually used a crude form of it unconsciously back during the Fourth Shinobi War, when he'd bumped fists with his father to sync up their chakra while relaying his plan to save the allied ninja forces from the Shinju's omnidirectional Bijudama. And similarly when he had crossed jutsu with Sasuke, each of them reading one another's hearts in the heat of battle. Working backwards from these instances, Naruto had eventually reverse-engineered his own variation of the sage's spiritual communication technique, with a good deal of help from Ino, whose specialization in yin-style mental ninjutsu was invaluable for working out the kinks. And with this technique, he was able to swap intel and communicate mentally at great length, with only a momentary brushing of fists. He didn't entirely understand the mechanics behind his technique, but Naruto knew that it worked, and he and Hinata had come to some very important decisions during their brief mental communion. That was a matter for another time, however. Right now, Naruto was rather preoccupied with a pair of familiar chakra signatures just outside his window. Going over, and hearing it open, Naruto took a moment to stare at his teammates. Sasuke and Sakura were standing just inside his windowsill, a fragrant breeze wafting in from behind them. Hello, Naruto. Have you come back, too? That was Sakura speaking. Her hair was cut short, to about the length she had come to prefer in the future. She was smiling, not a very wide or flashy grin, but rather just a slight, subtle quirking at the corner of her lips. It was a mild expression, showing just the slightest touch of general amusement. Caution, 2. Naruto frowned slightly, flicking his eyes over to Sasuke. He met the Uchiha's onyx orbs, and the raven-haired youth tilted his head ever so slightly, a quiet and subtle show of deference. Blue peepers slid down, then, and saw the bandaged stub hanging out of Sasuke's left sleeve. Naruto blinked. Then he face-palmed. "God damn it, Sasuke!" he muttered. "You can never leave well enough alone, can you?" The Uchiha quirked one of his eyebrows. "And by that, you mean?" he said slowly, probably in an attempt to verify what Naruto was talking about before actually spilling anything that might either incriminate them or get them tossed in an insane asylum. "Your arm," Naruto groaned. "Why is it gone?" "Again." "It's symbolic," Sasuke said blandly, seeming to relax slightly when Naruto said again. "The hand I used when I tried to kill you is gone. Discarding it signifies my resolve to turn aside from the dark path I walked in my younger years. It's a sign of my penitence, and of my ultimate acceptance of your philosophy." A beat. Naruto stared at Sasuke, looking distinctly unimpressed. "You know, I'm pretty sure you've tried to kill me plenty of times with your right hand, too," he drawled. Sasuke rolled his eyes. "Just because you don't appreciate the symbolism," he grumbled irritably. Sakura gave a weak chuckle, and a "what can you do?" sort of shrug. "For what it's worth, he hadn't realized we were back when he ripped it off," she told Naruto. "And I did offer to reattach it for him, since we're, you know, in the past and all. But, well." A sigh. "He burned it, didn't he?" Naruto deadpanned. He massaged his temples. To his credit, Sasuke somehow managed to make himself look almost innocent when the Lord Seventh said this. "Sorry," Sakura said, looking sincerely apologetic. "I tried to stop him, but—" No, it's okay," Naruto wearily interjected, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Honestly, compared to what Hinata did." "Oh? She came back too?" Sasuke said. "Yeah." Sakura frowned. "Wait, what did she do?" she wondered. Naruto coughed, and avoided looking in his teammate's eyes. He appeared awfully sheepish. Well, the rest of her clan might be under the impression that she's another Itachi waiting to happen," he mumbled. Sasuke and Sakura winced. "Yikes," the latter murmured. "So much for not changing things, huh? At least she won't have to worry about being called weak this time around," Sasuke said, trying to look on the bright side. Naruto and Sakura shared a sweat drop. "That's certainly one way of looking at it," the former mused. "Not necessarily the right way, but it's valid. It might cause more headaches in the long run, though," Sakura added, "for them to think of Hinata as strong. She'll be under more scrutiny, for one thing. She might also be granted more freedom of movement, on the flip side," Sasuke responded. "Which could be very useful, if we plan on figuring out a way to get back to our own time." "How would we even do that, actually?" Sakura wondered, chewing her lip thoughtfully. "If we don't know how we wound up going back in time in the first place?" "Well, first we'd need to find a time travel jutsu," Naruto said. "You know, to get an idea of the mechanics we're working with." "But there's no way to know which ones are real," Sasuke muttered. "Right? Not without trying them. That's why you sealed such techniques away, whenever you came across an alleged one." "Yeah, that's true," Naruto said with a grimace. "There's no real way to know which jutsu will work, if any. And while I suppose I could maybe figure something out from scratch, with enough time and the right resources, that'd take me years of trial and error." A silence descended on the trio, their faces falling. Their brows were furrowed in concentration, and they all looked lost in thought. "No matter how you look at this, we're probably going to be stuck here for a while," Sakura whispered at length. "So we might as well get settled in for the long haul." Sasuke gave his wife a sympathetic glance. She smiled weakly at him, seeming almost apologetic in her demeanor. Naruto sighed. "So much for not changing the past," he grumbled, looking ready to throw his hands up in the air. But there was the slightest twinkle of mischief in his eyes. Inside a training dojo of the Hyuga main branch, Kurenai Yuha was speaking to Hayashi. As you know, now that your daughter is a genin, she would ordinarily be expected to start going on missions, Kurenai said, choosing her words carefully. And, of course, while she will only be doing D ranks at first, it is to be expected that eventually she will have to do more dangerous jobs as well. She was inside an undamaged wing of the Hyuga Manor, a main branch dojo, speaking to the man as he distractedly sparred with a young girl, only just of age to consider entering the academy, from the looks of her. Probably another daughter of Hayashi's, she definitely bore a strong resemblance to the man, in a young and female sort of way. Hayashi seemed oddly anxious, considering the stoicism his clan was usually known for, and his movements as he batted aside a clumsy knife strike from his probable daughter looked suspiciously jerky for a supposed master of the incomparably fluid and graceful gentle fist style. And such missions will invariably carry with them a certain risk to my daughter's life, correct? Hayashi replied, his brow creased and furrowed. Indeed, Kurenai answered with a short nod. And in this time of peace, with no immediate military threats to the village, it is naturally your prerogative as her father, and clan head of the Hyuga, to request that she not be placed on such missions. As she is next in line to succeed you as clan head, I imagine that you might have reservations about Hinata needlessly risking her life. It would be well within my rights in this time of peace. Hayashi murmured, distractedly sidestepping a quick yet badly telegraphed lunge from the young girl with whom he presently sparred. To request that my daughter be held back from dangerous missions. This is a right afforded to all clan heads in peacetime, Kurenai said, sounding like she had spent most of the previous night rehearsing this speech. With no war to be fought, the village has an acceptable surplus of manpower, and there are no priorities which would supersede that of ensuring the succession of clan leadership. Hayashi made a face, and absent-mindedly struck a light blow to his likely younger daughter's shoulder. The girl winced, but nonetheless skipped back and corrected her stance appropriately. Beads of sweat trickled down her face, and she was panting heavily, but her eyes were hard and determined. Gripping the training kunai tighter, the young girl made another sharp lunge, this time sidestepping at the last second. She rotated, and managed to score a glancing hit at the belt of the clan head's kimono. Had the knife been sharpened, the girl probably would have made a rip in the cloth, maybe even drawn a thin line of blood across Hayashi's hip. Kurenai raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised that a person as famously strict and fastidious as Hayashi Hyuga would allow any trainee to land a hit on him with such an amateurish strike. The girl's combat form still left a lot to be desired, and she herself would have made several more corrections to her stance before even resuming the spar. Either the man was slipping as he approached middle age, or he was seriously distracted. Hayashi-san. She interjected. Would you like to continue this discussion outside? She said this politely enough, gently reminding the man of her presence. If what she had to say was making him worry so much as to slip up this egregiously in a training spar, then perhaps it would be in everyone's best interest if he postponed this lesson and devoted his full attention to their present conversation. The man blinked owlishly, looking as though he had suddenly been woken from a daydream. He shook his head, and for a moment Kurenai took this as a silent dismissal of her suggestion, but then he held out a hand and said, "That's enough for now, Hanabi. Continue practicing your forms in here," he told the girl, and now that Kurenai had her name, she no longer had to keep mentally referring to Hanabi as the girl. "I will speak with Yuha-san outside." Hayashi then turned and followed Kurenai out the nearby door, making the woman wonder briefly why he had even led her inside in the first place. Before she could ponder further on the matter, however, she heard a strangled yelp from behind her. The sound caught her off guard, and a ninja caught off guard was a very dangerous thing. Reacting immediately, Kurenai had her hands up and ready to start weaving seals, over a decade of combat experience preparing the woman to leap into action at the drop of a hat. Crimson eyes for which she had been named flicked intently over her surroundings, every fiber of the woman's being tensed and ready to fight. What she saw made her blink owlishly. Once, twice, 3 times. She stared blankly at the clan head of the Hyuga, dropping stiffly and disbelievingly out of her combat stance. Weakly, Kurenai shook her head. Hayashi Hyuga was halfway up the dojo wall, looking like a princess who had just seen a mouse or a poisonous viper. This hardened war veteran and elite Jounin class shinobi, a man renowned far and wide for his visual prowess and martial skill,
was staring bug-eyed, petrified, at the cutest and most harmless thing Kurenai had ever seen. "Hello, father," said Hinata Hyuga, greeting Hayashi with the sweetest of grins. "Kurenai-sensei," was added as an afterthought, the girl nodding politely in said woman's direction. Kurenai blinked again. She looked from Hayashi, to Hinata, to Hayashi again. "Did I miss something?" she said, feeling like she had been left completely out of the loop. Hinata smiled, and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, it was nothing, sensei," she said cheerfully. "Just an unfortunate misunderstanding. I assure you it won't happen again." She bowed towards her father, then, who was still cowering and clinging to the wall like some kind of silky-haired spider. It seemed the last part of that statement was addressed as much to Hayashi as to her. Kurenai was at a loss. What?" she said. So, do I have your permission, Hayashi-san?" The Hyuga clan head blushed, looking distinctly flustered, and he cleared his throat, though he didn't come down from the wall. Yes, of course," he said, audibly trying to maintain his composure. "Do whatever you wish. I give you full clearance to supervise my daughter's training." He then paused. Unless, of course, you would like to say otherwise, Hinata." He glanced nervously at the girl, who replied with a soft smile and short shake of her head. "No," she said. "I will be happy to study under Kurenai-sensei and broaden my horizons." Hayashi nodded nervously. "Well, okay then," he said almost a little too eagerly. "That's that. Yes, feel free to go along. I'm sure your teammates are waiting for you, dear." Hinata smiled a little wider, and nodded. "Thank you very much, father," she said with another bow, before turning to Kurenai. "Well, then. Shall we be off, Kurenai-sensei?" The genjutsu expert nodded dumbly, bemused. Hinata clapped her hands together gently, and nodded, before quietly turning and walking off. Kurenai, at a loss for words, followed the girl to the training grounds where Shino and Kiba would probably be waiting soon enough for their first official mission. Kurenai felt like she would be happy to pitch in. D ranks were mind-numbingly dull, but at least they made sense. 596-03, Naruto said. His teammates stared at him blankly. Said Sakura. "A delivery ninja," the blonde elaborated. "He's someone I, met in the past." Future. He frowned. "Other timeline." A pause. "Yeah, let's go with that. What would you need a delivery ninja for?" Sasuke inquired, looking a touch curious. "I don't recall you ever using such services during your tenure as Hokage." Naruto averted his gaze, looking distinctly sheepish. Well, let's just say that me and Pervy Sage kinda got ourselves blacklisted by them during our training trip. Those guys don't mess around when it comes to their no-ship list." Sakura blinked. "Oh, I think I heard about that. It's the same reason you wound up taking on Jiraiya-sama's mantle as author of the Icha-Icha series, right?" The pinkette said. "I still can't believe you read that, smut," Sasuke added in a mutter, rolling his eyes. Sakura shrugged. "It's very entertaining smut," she said flippantly. "Say what you will about his research methods, but Jiraiya-sama knew how to write an engaging novel. More's the pity he never managed to get an audience outside of that thinly veiled porn," Naruto sighed. "I would have loved to see a sequel to his Legend of a Gutsy Ninja." He shook his head, then, and waved a hand as if to physically dismiss this particular tangent. "But, anyways, my point is, I can use their services now, since..." He blushed. That incident never happened, now." He gave Sasuke a meaningful look. "Seeing as how some of us have already gone ahead and started changing shit, I figure I might as well throw caution to the wind. What's the worst that could happen, right?" Sasuke drawled. Sakura nodded. "I wonder what you have in mind, though." "Hokage-sama." Sasuke smirked, catching onto his wife's distinctly obeisant tone. There was only one reason Sakura would speak so deferentially to their teammate, and that was if she wanted something from him. Last time she called Naruto Hokage-sama,
the Medic Ninja Corps had experienced a fourfold increase in funding. It had only been until the other departments raised a stink over the obvious favoritism, but still that one sentence had afforded the hospital several much-needed upgrades and new pieces of equipment. Naruto may have long ago grown out of his precocious crush on Sakura, but he still had something of a soft spot for the woman. The Honorable Lord Seventh chuckled nervously, puffing up visibly at Sakura's remark. His cheeks pinkened, and he sheepishly scratched the back of his neck. "Gee, Sakura, it always sounds so flattering when you call me that," he chirped, looking quite giddy. "But, well, I guess I have wondered what it might have been like if I could have found some way to reach out to certain people earlier. Especially knowing what I know now." His eyes twinkled, and Sasuke couldn't help but get a shiver down his spine. He knew this look all too well. Shikamaru had once said that there was nothing more dangerous than an idiot with an idea. And the couple of idiots standing before him were hands down two of the most dangerous people on the face of the earth. "It would be very convenient to have Tsunade-sama back in the village," Sakura said offhandedly, batting her eyelashes at Naruto in an almost sickeningly cute fashion. "And she is family of yours, after all?" Sasuke hummed thoughtfully. He scratched his chin as though stroking an imaginary beard, a spark of slightest mischief in the depths of his eyes. "My brother is still alive," he said, making it out as though he were just muttering this absent-mindedly. "And Danzo is still kicking around, kicking puppies and all that." Naruto grinned. "That's one person I regret not being able to get to before he kicked the bucket," he remarked. "It seems a real shame that such undying conviction should have been wasted on his own selfish machinations." Sakura smirked. "You have a plan," she observed. "I wouldn't call it a plan," Naruto replied. "More like a few crazy, half-baked ideas." Sasuke laughed. "That's our Hokage," he drawled. Naruto puffed up proudly, and Sakura giggled. "First things first, though," the pinkette remarked. "We should probably get to the training grounds. Today's the day of the bell test, and it's getting close to when Kakashi-sensei should arrive." Sasuke and Naruto shared a look. They grinned, a shared thought passing between them. Payback time. Chapter 4, We Wanna Rock. Kakashi Hatake was many things. An elite jonin, a child prodigy, the sole surviving student of the Yellow Flash. He was the only person outside the Uchiha clan to ever master the Sharingan, a former Umbu Black Ops captain, and the son of the White Fang. To call him a genius would be an understatement. He held the record for earliest genin promotion in the history of the Hidden Leaf, and had become a chunin at an even younger age than the legendary Sunin. By the time he was the age of these recent academy graduates, he had already earned his place among the village elite and proven himself qualified to serve as a Junin. He was the famed Sharingan Kakashi, who was said to have penetrated and copied over 1,000 different spells and illusions. He was one of the very best shinobi in the Leaf, by some people considered to be a living legend in his own right. And he was still in his prime, still growing and improving. So perhaps he held his prospective students to an unrealistically high standard. Maybe it wasn't fair of him to have so harshly failed every genin squad he'd thus far been saddled with. But Kakashi could still remember the blood-stained tragedy his own team had become, and survivor's guilt was nothing to sneeze at. Kakashi was not what you would call a well-adjusted individual. He had more emotional baggage than a luxury cruise for recovering alcoholics, enough eccentricities and neuroses to send lesser men straight into a white padded cell. For a long time, the only thing that kept him getting up in the morning was sheer force of habit. By civilian standards, he would be considered an unstable basket case. By ex-Black Ops standards, he was only a little below the curve. That was not a career generally conducive to cultivating a healthy psyche. People like Tenzo and Yojao were more the exception than the rule. Most turned out like Kakashi, or like Danzo. The rest either burned out, dropped out, or went rogue. Even Itachi Uchiha had really only been exceptional in the scale of his breakdown. Well, that, and the suddenness of it. But there was a good reason most people knew the Ansatsu Senjutsu Takushu Butai as Umbu. They were the dark side of the shinobi forces, doing all of the dirty, unethical, and even downright illegal work that most people thought of when they thought ninja. Honestly, Kakashi would not wish such a career path on his worst enemy. It was miserable, demanding, and unrewarding work. Even the staggeringly high pay of frequent S-rank missions was hardly worth the trauma and emotional scarring. He was one of the last people who should have been entrusted with cultivating the next generation of Leaf Shinobi. Whoever thought it would be a good idea to repeatedly try and saddle an ex-Umbu captain like him with a genin team clearly needed their head examined. That was Kakashi's opinion, at least. But still, as he neared the training grounds where the Lord Third's latest attempt at getting him to either overcome his emotional baggage or at least pass on some of his knowledge to the next generation were no doubt impatiently awaiting his arrival, the copy ninja could not help but mentally grumble various imprecations against the Hokage and his advisors. Damn you, Sandaime, he thought darkly, his one visible eye narrowed, expression hard and stony. You'd better keep a close eye on that special edition Icha in your lower right-hand desk drawer. It would be a shame if anything happened to it. Genius shinobi or not, he was not above plotting petty revenge. Kakashi stared when he finally arrived at the training grounds. Of all the things he had been anticipating, he had not expected this. His 3 prospective students were sitting together before the training posts, amicably chatting and snacking. Each of them had a bento box in their lap and a smile on their face. They were talking like old friends, discussing subjects trivial and meaningful alike. Not only had they completely disregarded his very ominous warning to not eat any breakfast, but they were visibly getting along quite well. Maybe one of them had actually bothered to do their research. Kakashi blinked, then, noticing that Sakura had apparently gotten herself a haircut. The academy photos showed her with long hair that bordered on blatantly impractical for a ninja as young and inexperienced as her, but the girl sitting on Naruto's right had her tresses cut sensibly short. Huh. So she's gotten herself a haircut? Not like that will make much of a difference, of course. A more optimistic man might have taken heart at this, and felt a slight twinge of hopefulness that the girl would prove herself as a dedicated kunoichi. Kakashi wasn't feeling half as generous. Next he eyed Naruto, his sensei's son, and the vessel of the Kyuubi. A part of Kakashi felt a tiny flicker of guilt at not going out of his way to try and connect with the boy before now, but the rest of him deadpanned that a neurotic, emotionally scarred Umbu captain wouldn't have exactly been the best influence for a young, attention-starved orphan. Looking closely, however, Kakashi noted that the boy seemed a little quieter than yesterday. He was less noisy, less demanding for people to focus on him. There was something mellower in his demeanor, less of a pup's yapping in his words. It was like he no longer felt the need to repeatedly and vehemently assert his existence with every word to leave his mouth. Perhaps graduating the academy had soothed some of the lad's insecurities. Maybe Naruto believed that he was finally being acknowledged as a true shinobi, and that people would finally begin to accept him for who he was. Or maybe he just wore himself out yammering away at his teammates all morning, Kakashi thought critically, before turning his attention over to the third member of the squad. One thing was immediately apparent. A beat. Kakashi stared at the stump of Sasuke Uchiha's left arm. Ah, the silver-haired shinobi blurted out, blinking owlishly. Hello, then. What happened to your arm? Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke did not look surprised by the sound of his voice. Although they hadn't acknowledged his arrival, they did seem to know he was there. Not too surprising, since he hadn't really been erasing his presence, but the fact that they didn't respond in any way to his arrival was mildly perplexing. Late or not, he was their commanding officer. It wasn't as though he expected matching salutes and a chorused sir, but the absence of even a mutinous grumble at being made to wait for so long did seem rather uncharacteristic for at least 2 of these kids. That aside, however, the fact that the Rookie of the Year was visibly lacking one of his arms was more pressing in Kakashi's mind, if only for how unexpected it was. He hadn't heard anything about the kid losing a limb, and he was pretty sure that wasn't something the Lord Third would have glossed over in his briefing. Had the boy had a training accident after their meeting yesterday? Such things were not unheard of, even with the best of ninja, and an unsupervised academy student trying out a jutsu beyond his skill level could certainly do some serious damage to himself. The timing was rather unfortunate, though. Before Kakashi could continue further on into a mental spiel about all the ways that an orphaned academy graduate with a missing limb could get totally fucked over by the system, however, Sasuke languidly turned his head to meet the copy ninja's eye. The boy's expression was inscrutably deadpan. I fell down the stairs, was Sasuke's blithe response.
Kakashi blinked again. Oh. I see, he said lamely. It was all he could say, really. How the hell was a person supposed to respond to something like that? It was obviously a lie, but calling the kid out on it wouldn't really accomplish anything. Not if he was still stubborn enough to show up for his genin test. The face-palming which ensued on Sakura and Naruto's parts did not escape Kakashi's notice, either. They probably knew the truth of the matter, or else could guess it well enough. Kakashi shook his head. Well, I guess I won't bore you by saying you should seriously consider a career change. He drawled, but don't think I'll go easy on you just because you're a cripple, either. He noticed the kid's eye twitch. Ah. A sore spot, was it? Don't think we'll go easy on you just because it's 3 against 1, Sasuke replied with a sharp look, his tone as cool as ice. Kakashi's visible eye crinkled, and he let out a laugh. My. It's nice that you're confident of your chances, he remarked, waving a hand dismissively. But I haven't even explained the details of this survival exercise yet. He flicked an eye over the bento lunches the 3 were finishing up. And I'm a little surprised you 3 didn't heed my warning, by the way. Sakura shrugged, closing her empty lunchbox. Better to face a difficult mission properly nourished, she quipped. It would hardly be very professional to let nerves keep us from eating. I see. Aren't you the clever one, Kakashi commented, amusedly stroking his chin through his mask. Let's hope that shrewdness doesn't backfire on you, He took a pair of bells from his pocket, then, his expression going neutral. Now, about your test. Can you guess what we're going to do with these? He drawled, flicking his wrist to ring the little bells. Naruto put the lid on his bento box, and shot a lazy glance at the petite ornaments. Take those bells from you. He guessed, making a show of stifling a yawn. Easy as cake. Kakashi's eye twitched. He let out a small huff. Well, yes. You will have to take these bells from me, he said, the tiniest hint of annoyance momentarily creeping into his tone. He'd had a whole monologue and everything ready to put the fear of God in these little greenhorns, but they kept taking the wind out of his sails. And anyone who doesn't get a bell will be sent back to the academy, I'm sure, Sasuke droned, sounding far too bored to actually be discussing the possibility of being flunked and forced to start his education all over again. Kakashi was silent for a moment. His eye twitched twice this time. He nodded, then, after a brief pause. Yes. Yes, they will. And you know what else? He said, sounding much more cheerful than was safe. You have only an hour to do it. Sakura chuckled. That long? She said. You must really not have a very high opinion of us. A dangerous gleam came into her eyes. For a second, Kakashi could have sworn that he saw her smirk. Naruto clapped his hands once, and hopped to his feet with a grunt. That's something we'll have to remedy, the blonde commented, grinning in a way that reminded Kakashi a little too much of the late Kushina. It wouldn't do for him to doubt his student's capabilities, after all. Cerulean orbs flashed, as much amusement as determination. Naruto's smile showed far too many teeth as he raised his hands up to chest height, holding out a fist to either of his teammates. Sasuke smirked at the whiskered prankster. He bumped fists, matching Naruto's left hand with his right. Then he closed his eyes. Sakura mirrored Sasuke's gesture, bumping Naruto's other fist and closing her own eyes. She had a frightening grin on her face. For a second, everything was still. What? A Naruto in his late teens stared disbelievingly at an older, Sharingan-less Kakashi. Standing next to him was a one-armed Sasuke, who looked distinctly ruffled. You heard me, Kakashi drawled, a slightest wrinkling around his eyes betraying the amused tilt of his lips. Neither of you was ever officially promoted beyond genin rank. Naruto's face reddened, and he spluttered. Oh, come on. He protested. That's bullshit, sensei. Are you seriously gonna tell me that saving the whole damn world wasn't worth a field promotion? Kakashi shrugged, as though he had no say in the matter and was just relaying this unfortunate news to the pair, which all 3 present knew was not the case. What can I say? The paperwork never went through. Sasuke's eye twitched. You know, I was promoted to Chunin rank in Oto.
Naruto glowered at his friend, annoyed. And what happens in Oto stays in Oto, Kakashi quipped. You're a leaf ninja now, again, and that means you're back to the rank you had before your, desertion. Sasuke flinched. His fingers curled into a fist. Are you seriously telling us that we have to retake the Chunin exams? Naruto asked, looking highly exasperated. Kakashi smiled at his two male students. Yes, he said cheerfully. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura's eyes snapped open again a second later. Chunks of grassy turf began to fly up around the three, the ground trembling at their feet. Waves washed away from them on the surface of the nearby pond, completely defying all conventional logic. The surrounding trees swayed and cracked, as though buffeted by a frightful gale. Kakashi blinked. The little bit of his face that was actually visible looked distinctly pale. Sakura grinned, and pulled her fist apart from Naruto's. Her eyes gleamed with an unholy light, and she shifted her legs. You know the plan. Naruto said. Sasuke and Sakura nodded. The former separated his fist from Naruto's, raising his hand in the seal of confrontation. Kick his ass, get the bells, Sasuke drawled. Nice and simple. I don't even need anything fancy for this. Sakura grinned, and hummed her agreement. Not much call for a medic yet, either, she remarked. But this is about showing teamwork. Naruto nodded, and clapped his hands together. Scatter! He barked. All three of them blurred, and vanished. Kakashi blinked again, quite dumbstruck. I have a bad feeling about this, he mused to himself. A second later, his instincts were screaming at him to move, and his body jerked back on paranoid reflex. He saw a flicker of pink out of the corner of his eye, and the ground where he had just been standing burst apart, compacted turf buckling and splitting. Chunks of soil ripped through the air, pelting Kakashi with grass and dirt. Sakura dislodged her fist from the center of a small impact crater. She had a savage grin on her face. Lesson number 1, the girl said all too sweetly, absent-mindedly brushing a bit of soil from her knuckles. Taijutsu. Kakashi stared. Wah. He managed to intelligently say, before being forced to sidestep a vicious straight thrust from the girl's fist. A rip appeared in his flak vest, even though the punch missed him by a good several inches. Kakashi felt a bead of nervous sweat trickle down past his eye. Sakura spun, and brought her leg around in a low sweep. Kakashi just barely jumped over it, and he heard a small tree fall over several meters away in an event he hoped to high heavens had nothing to do with the girl's kick. A small fist rocketed up towards his abdomen, then, and the log that took the copy ninja's place exploded into a sizable cloud of sawdust. Oh? Replacement jutsu. How very droll, sensei. Sakura smirked, and her eyes flicked over to a seemingly inconspicuous bit of foliage in the surrounding forest. She cracked her knuckles ominously. Kakashi, who had replaced himself with the brave log that was now floating through the air in puffs of infinitely fine particulate matter, mentally swore when he realized the girl was looking right at him. Briefly, the man wondered if it wouldn't be prudent to uncover Obito's Sharingan. Relatedly, he also wondered what the hell they were teaching kids at the academy these days. Was somebody trying to get back at him for failing all those other teams? Logically, there was no way a fresh academy graduate should have been able to boast that kind of speed and power, but logic seemed to have called in sick today. Kakashi was starting to feel a bit numb, and not just from Sakura's barely missed punches. He was thus only marginally horrified when the girl in question grinned wider than ever, cocked her fist back, and Kakashi would later attest that, no matter what his students may say, he absolutely did not scream like a little girl when Sakura Haruno somehow managed to level a full 3 acres of woodland just by punching at the air in his general direction. This was not just saving face, either. He didn't have enough breath left in him to even whisper after the first shockwave hit, and only through a quick and frantic application of the art of subterranean locomotion was he able to avoid being crushed under several tons of timber. Just to be safe, he tunneled real deep. You know, in case Sakura decided to punch the ground again. Okay, Kakashi, he thought to himself. Maybe the girl is some kind of freak mini tsunade, and maybe you're in shock and unable to properly assess the situation. But you're a Jonin, and they're sensei. You have to get your head in the game and show these little genin what's what. Easier said than done, a more bitter part of the man longed to reply. But in terms of sanity, Kakashi drew the line at holding literal conversations with himself. So, instead, he grit his teeth, took a deep breath, and felt a kunai nick his shoulder. Right through his flak vest. Also, several meters of rock and soil. Well then. Another kunai came down through the earth, barely missing his face. Even with his Sharingan still covered, it was hardly a feat of brilliance to deduce that lightning-natured chakra was probably being channeled through the knives. He could feel his hair stand up on end when it passed. Deciding that valor was, in this case, the better part of discretion, Kakashi reluctantly returned to the surface, narrowly avoiding a few more lighting kunai. The second he could feel the sun on his face once again, the Hound Summoner found himself eye-to-eye with very curious-looking Sharingan. Rather than the usual 1, 2, or 3 tomo, it had a strange pattern in red and black, almost like something you might see in a gothic kaleidoscope. Lesson number 2, came Sasuke's half-bored, half-vindictive tone. Genjutsu. All at once, everything was in shades of red and black. Kakashi found himself in vaguely familiar surroundings, sitting behind a desk at the academy. The other seats were all filled with Sasuke doppelgangers, and an unfamiliar Chunin stood at the front of the classroom, droning on about some topic or other. Kakashi blinked sleepily, frowning underneath his cloth mask. His legs were jammed most uncomfortably under the desk, the seats far too small for a grown man. Judging by the contents of the chalkboard, the subject matter being covered was also similarly well beneath him. Tediously trivial. It was a dreadfully mundane illusion, aside from the starkly dichromatic surroundings. The Chunin instructor continued to prattle monotonously on, completely uncaring that one of his students was a grown-up, and a jonin. Boring or not, however, this was still a genjutsu, and he was virtually defenseless while trapped within it. Also, he had never liked sitting in a classroom. It was a big part of the reason he'd pushed to graduate as early as he did. Concentrating, Kakashi brought his hands up into a seal. He exhaled sharply, simultaneously flaring and scrambling his chakra. Kai. Nothing happened. Kakashi frowned. Tricky little buggers. He muttered, before bringing a hand up to his forehead protector. I guess I'll have to quit holding back, then. He lifted the Hitaiate from over his left eye, exposing a fully matured 3-tomo Sharingan. A beat. Kakashi stared blankly at the illusion, which his Sharingan was seemingly unable to penetrate. He saw his surroundings exactly as he would have expected to see them, if he were actually sitting in a classroom, even with the altered perception afforded to him by Obito's eye. Well then. That much, at least, made a little sense. Only someone who knew what the world looked like through a Sharingan could create a genjutsu that could fool those eyes. Otherwise, it would be like a colorblind person trying to craft an illusion capable of fooling people who could actually distinguish between red and blue. And unfortunately for Kakashi, Sasuke was neither colorblind nor lacking in genjutsu proficiency. The lecture carried on, and Kakashi quickly ran himself ragged trying to figure out some way to escape his prospective student's illusion. Time lost all meaning as the instructor droned on and on, never running out of mind-numbingly boring subject matter to discuss. 6 hours into the illusion, 1/4 of a second had passed in real time. Sasuke chose then to release the genjutsu, not quite wanting to render the man before him outright comatose. For a moment, Kakashi was dazed. Then he blinked, and stared at the Uchiha for a fraction of a second. Cursing, he sprang away. A tactical retreat, ostensibly. In his hurry, Kakashi failed to notice the bell dangling from Sasuke's hand. Do you think you will need to borrow any of my chakra for this, Naruto? Kurama's voice rumbled in the back of the blonde's mind. He could sense their target approaching, clearly dumbstruck and frazzled. Sakura was closing in on their location, too, maybe about 30 seconds from intercept. Sasuke was hanging back, for now. Naruto shrugged, grinning under the cover of a bush. Nah. We just wanna knock him around a little, not send him into the ICU. This response elicited something between a chuckle and a yawn from the lazy old Kyuubi. I see. Wake me up when something interesting happens, then, won't you? Naruto nodded, more out of habit than any need to do so when communicating with the nine-tailed fox inside his mind. "Yeah, sure. I will," he promised. Then, with a wicked grin, Naruto willed 3 shadow clones into existence above his head. A trio of Kagebunshin leaped down from the canopy, shouting raucously and immediately catching their target's attention. "Kick his ass!" one shouted. "Ichiraku Banzai!" cried the second. "Believe it!" the third crowed. They landed right in front of the Jonin, and charged. Their guards were wide open, taijutsu stances horrendously sloppy. Kakashi's hands were a blur. He effortlessly dispatched the 3 clones, stunning each one with short, quick, non-lethal taijutsu strikes. Nearly as one, the clones burst, vanishing in puffs of white smoke. Kakashi shook his head and tooted in disappointment, seeming to relax slightly now that he was in more familiar territory. "What a shame," the man drawled. "Compared to the showing Sasuke and Sakura have made, it looks like you'll be the one sent back to the academy, Naruto." It was a bluff, of course. This test was an all-or-nothing deal. Kakashi's intention was to test them as a team, not as individuals. If they couldn't set aside their differences and work together, then they would fail no matter how well they did. Naruto conjured up 6 more shadow clones, and had them attack in the same strategy as the previous 3. Kakashi scowled, and dispelled these ones just as effortlessly. "Really, Naruto, this is just a disappointing showing," the man drawled, visibly frowning. "What are you 3 up to?" As if in answer to his unspoken question, Sakura burst into the clearing, screaming bloody murder. Kakashi's eyes nearly bugged out of his head. Had Naruto just been stalling him? "Shan Naro!" The pinkette roared, cocking a fist back as she flew straight at the Jonin. Kakashi yelped, actually yelped, and ducked hurriedly out of the girl's way. She missed him by scarce inches, another sizable rip appearing in the man's flak vest. The Hound Summoner winced, looking like he might as well have been slugged with a direct hit from an ironclad fist. Naruto grinned. "Now!" he cried, leaping out of the bush. His hands blurred through a number of seals. "Time for lesson number 3, Kakashi-sensei." He clapped his palms together, and the forest shifted under the weight of his chakra. Ninjutsu. There was a flash of light. The ground shuddered and groaned beneath Kakashi's feet. "Sexy style, Icha harem jutsu." Kakashi blinked. The smoke cleared. He saw that he was surrounded by dozens of gorgeous, scantily clad women. Notably, every last one of them resembled one heroine or another from the closet pervert's favorite book series. From sexy librarian Yukina, to sensual innkeeper Midaspa, to shy but secretly adventurous Akane, and of course the dark, emotionless ninja beauty, Ibuki. Every last detail was absolutely perfect. From the most obvious repeated descriptors to the subtlest inferred qualities, not one thing was missing or different from Kakashi's mental category. The girls looked exactly as he had always imagined them, and every last one was eyeing him up and down in a way that said they liked what they saw. In an instant, the copy ninja was swamped. Gorgeous women identical to the many sexy heroines of his favorite series of novels threw themselves at him, cooing and repeating many of their cutest or most suggestive lines from the books. "Oh, darling. Do you want dinner, a bath, or me? It's not like I'm doing this cause I want to. Babaka. Is that a kunai in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" Jiraiya had many talents. Writing creative dialogue was not one of them. Now, normally, a technique like Naruto's sexy jutsu would have minimal effect on Kakashi. The man had plenty of real women all but throwing themselves at him everywhere he went, after all. He was all but desensitized to the female form. This, on the other hand, this was something else entirely. Everyone had their weakness. Everyone had their price. Everyone had their fetish. Icha was Kakashi's. The ensuing fountain of blood was strong enough to punch straight through the man's mask, flinging him backwards through the forest. "You pass." Kakashi Hatake exclaimed with a tear in his eye. Seconds later, the horde of half-naked smut heroines descended upon him. They were absolutely merciless. Naruto, the original, turned to grin at Sakura. The pinkette smirked back at him, dangling a bell from her fist.
Sasuke chose then to hop down from the branches overhead, idly fiddling with the bell in his hand. I'm surrounded by perverts, he groused, espying the slight trickle of blood on Sakura's upper lip. The pinkette shrugged. Kakashi-sensei is very handsome under that mask of his, she said flippantly. And Naruto's sexy jutsu is quite compelling, too. Naruto laughed, looking smug. Sasuke rolled his eyes, and shook his head. Ah, whatever, he muttered. Turning to Naruto, he said, hey. Did you ever get a hold of that delivery ninja? Naruto glanced from the continuing carnage of his Icha-Icha harem jutsu, which also happened to be the name of his latest installment in the Icha-Icha series, ghostwritten by Kano Amaru. Yeah, he said. I gave him the letters and the instructions. We ought to be getting our SVPs back sometime between now and, well, when the wave mission started, last time. Sasuke nodded, looking satisfied. Sakura seemed completely incapable of tearing her eyes away from the Lord Seventh's most fearsome jutsu behind the ultra-massive Bijudama Raisin Shuriken Omni-Elemental Barrage. Mark 7. Kakashi, for his part, was convinced that he had died and gone straight to Icha-Icha heaven. Which he was perfectly okay with. That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.